Um, Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so today we are really stripping away the romance of the New York City skyline
We really are.
because we're looking at a story that basically suggests, every time you look up at a water tower or cross a bridge or just walk past a brownstone, you're essentially walking past a crime scene.
Yeah, it's a very heavy way to open, but it's completely accurate.
Right.
We're looking at the concrete and the steel of New York, but we're asking what, or really who, got mixed into the mortar.
Exactly. And so for this deep dive, we are jumping into a book called Elizabeth Street by Laurie Fabiano.
Right.
And right off the bat, I think we have to clarify what this source actually is. Because it's a novel, technically.
Technically, yes. But it is definitely not fiction in the way we usually think of it.
No, not at all.
It's much closer to a reconstructed memoir. Fabiano is actually writing about her own great-grandmother.
A woman named Giovanna Costa.
Right, Giovanna. And Fabiano spent years, literally years, digging through ship manifests, court records from 1902, family letters, just to piece this whole narrative together.
So the dialogue might be imagined to fill in the gaps, but the actual events.
The tragedy, the lawsuit, the specific dates and locations, all of that is historical fact.
Right. And before we get into the actual plot of Giovanna's life, I want to talk about the hook the source uses.
Oh, the two Scillas.
Yes. The source material opens with this incredibly striking metaphor that basically frames the entire immigrant experience for this community. It talks about the old Scilla and the new Scilla.
It's a classical reference.
Right.
To anyone who, hasn't brushed up on their Homer recently.
Right, the Odyssey.
Exactly. So Scilla is this six-headed sea monster from Greek mythology, and she lived on a rock in the Strait of Messina.
Which is right between Calabria, the toe of the Italian boot, and the island of Sicily.
Right. So in the myth, sailors had to navigate this incredibly narrow strait. On one side, you had Scilla, the rock monster that would just snatch sailors right off the deck and eat them.
Just terrifying.
And then on the exact opposite side was Charybdis, which was this massive whirlpool that would just suck the whole ship down.
Hence the phrase, being between a rock and a hard place.
That is the literal original definition of it, yes.
But what's fascinating is how the source material shifts this metaphor. It describes the ancient physical danger of the rock in Calabria, the geography of it, as the old Scilla.
Right.
But the old Scilla isn't just a mythic monster anymore. It represents the poverty, the starvation, the absolute lack of any future in southern Italy at the time.
But then it introduces the new Scilla.
Yes. And the new Scilla is America.
Specifically, the industrial machinery of America. The text has this really haunting line. It says, "L'America is worse than a cheap whore, a mala femina."
Wow.
Yeah, it says America lures men away with these grand promises of gold and prosperity, and then it devours them.
It eats them alive.
Literally. So instead of being eaten by a sea monster on a rock in the Mediterranean, these men are being devoured by the construction sites, the coal mines, the factories of the New World.
That sets the tone so perfectly. Because this isn't your typical, coming to America, saw the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, worked hard, bought a house kind of story.
Not at all.
This is gritty. It is highly visceral. And it centers completely on this one woman, Giovanna Costa.
And really, our mission for you today is to peel back the layers of that specific experience. We want to get way beyond the Ellis Island cliches.
Right. We want to look at the actual mechanics of how New York City was built, the engineering, the physics of it.
And the human cost that was required to achieve it.
Exactly. And there's also this incredible detective story buried in here, too. It's about a widow's quest for truth against a massive, incredibly powerful corporation.
It really has everything.
It does. So let's just start where the story starts. We are in Scilla, Calabria. It's the 1890s.
And Scilla is a real place. It still is. It's stunning, but historically, it was brutal.
Yep.
It's a fishing village built right into the cliffs. The specific neighborhood where our main characters live is called the Chianalea.
Which translates roughly to the neighborhood of the fishermen, right?
Right. And these houses are perched literally right on the water.
I mean, the text describes the water there as this brilliant azure blue. Completely crystal clear. You can see the coral reefs right off the shore. You can see old shipwrecks.
That sounds totally idyllic.
It does. It sounds like a vacation destination.
Visually, yes. It's an absolute paradise.
Right.
But economically, it is a complete disaster zone.
Right.
And that's the sharp contrast the source material really leans into. You have this place that is described as a piece of heaven fallen to earth, but the people living inside that heaven are slowly starving to death.
And this is exactly where we meet our two leads, Giovanna and Nunzio. And I just love their dynamic right from the start because it feels so, I don't know, fateful.
Yeah.
They're just neighbors. They are deeply intertwined from birth.
Well, they're cousins, first of all,
Hmm.
which was very common for the time and place in these highly isolated cliffside villages. They were born just months apart. They grew up literally 2 doors down from each other. The text says they were like vines on an Indian fig tree. You couldn't tell where one started and the other ended.
But fundamentally, as individuals, they are very, very different people.
Mm-hmm.
Nunzio is referred to as the maestro.
Nunzio Costa. Yes, he's a redhead, which really stands out in southern Italy.
Yeah, definitely.
And he's a true intellectual. He's an engineer at heart. Even as a young kid, he's not just playing with toy boats in the water. He's looking at the actual fishing boats and figuring out the hydrodynamics.
He's reverse engineering them.
Exactly. He sees the entire world in structures and numbers and physics.
And he actually gets out of the village for a bit, right? He goes to Rome.
He does, which is a huge deal for a peasant boy from the Chianolia to go all the way to Rome to study engineering. That's like going to the moon for them.
Right.
It implies a level of absolute brilliance that just couldn't be ignored by the people around him.
So you have Nunzio, the intellectual air sign, basically.
Okay.
And then you have Giovanna.
Giovanna Costa is the earth to Nunzio's air.
Yes.
She's the pragmatist, she's strong, she's tall, and she has this natural healing touch. She ends up apprenticing with the local village midwife, Signora Scalici.
Learning the old ways.
Exactly. Herbalism, setting broken bones, delivering babies in incredibly tough conditions.
And despite their differences, she has this very deep spiritual connection to Nunzio. The book describes it as almost telepathic.
It's that classic twin-like bond. She just knows when he's hurtling, she knows when he's afraid, even from a distance.
And the author establishes that early on so that when their separation happens, it isn't just a physical distance. It feels like splitting a single soul in half.
Exactly.
So you have the dreamer engineer and the pragmatic healer. They are deeply in love. They want to build a life.
Yeah,
But the world around them is literally crumbling.
it is.
And this really brings us to the why. Why leave this beautiful paradise? We constantly hear about immigrants seeking opportunity, seeking the American dream. But in this text, it's so much more about escaping sheer suffocation.
We really have to talk about the Risorgimento.
The unification of Italy.
Right. I think most people have this very vague idea from high school history class that Italian unification in 1861 was this glorious romantic moment where Italy finally became one happy boot-shaped country.
Right. Garibaldi, Viva Italia, all the flag waving.
Exactly. But the source material paints a completely different picture.
Very different.
For the North, places like Piedmont, Milan, it was great. They gained a massive new market. But for the South, the Mezzogiorno, it was catastrophic.
Yeah.
The source material is very explicit here. The South felt conquered, not unified. The new Italian government in the North basically treated the South like a colony to be exploited.
And the primary weapon they used to do that was taxes.
Crushing, impossible taxes. They taxed absolutely everything to pay for the North's rapid industrialization. I mean, they taxed the goats.
Wait, hold on. Taxing goats. How does that even work?
Per head. So if you were a poor peasant living on a cliff, relying entirely on goat milk and cheese for your family's protein,
Right.
suddenly you have to pay a cash tax on every single goat you own, and they don't have cash.
So what do?
They can't afford it. They have to sell the herd or slaughter it just to avoid the tax man. So now you have no milk, you have no cheese, you have no food.
That's devastating.
And then they tax the mules.
Which means you can't plow your fields.
Exactly. You literally have to plow the rocky fields by hand, breaking your own back.
That is just... But the most insane one, and the text really highlights this, is that they tax the rain.
Okay, that sounds like hyperbole. How do you physically tax the rain? You can't put a meter on a cloud.
It sounds like a metaphor, I know, but it was completely literal.
Seriously?
Yes. In a place like Calabria, water is incredibly scarce. People had built these stone cisterns on their property to catch whatever rainwater fell, just so they could water their tiny gardens.
The government decided to tax the cisterns based on their volume, so they effectively monetized the weather.
That is absolutely diabolical. So if you want to grow a few tomatoes to feed your starving family,
Yeah.
You have to pay the government a tax on the water that naturally falls from the sky.
Precisely. It was a poverty trap, completely designed by the state. So people were forced to destroy their own cisterns just to avoid going to prison for unpaid taxes.
And then their gardens died.
And then they starved. It created this massive, deep class divide. You had the glantuomini, the gentry.
Right.
They ran the local government and completely exempted themselves from all these laws. And then you had the peasants who were quite literally starving to death.
So when we talk about the push factor of immigration for this specific wave of Italians, it's not just some vague, oh, I want a better job in a factory.
No.
It's my government is actively engineering a famine and trying to starve my children.
Correct. It wasn't an immigration wave, it was an exodus. The text mentions there was a literal funeral atmosphere in the village whenever someone left for America. It wasn't a celebration. Nobody was cheering. When Nunzio finally decides he has to go because there is simply no work for an engineer in the South and they desperately need money, it's treated as a tragedy.
Because they need that money for a very specific reason, right?
Yeah.
The plan wasn't just basic survival. The plan was for Giovanna to become a doctor.
Which was a radically progressive dream for 1901.
Yeah, a female doctor from a peasant village in Calabria.
Nunzio was a real visionary in that way. He fully believed in Giovanna's mind. He saw her potential. He wanted to earn enough American dollars in New York to eventually bring her over and pay for her medical school tuition.
But first, he has to actually survive the new Scilla.
Which is easier said than done.
So Nunzio leaves, he crosses the Atlantic, and this is where the source material gives us this incredible sensory overload of a description.
Oh, yeah.
You really have to imagine a man who has never seen a building taller than 3 stories in his entire life arriving in 1901 Manhattan.
It must have been absolutely terrifying. He walks out and he sees the elevated train roaring right overhead. The text says he actually grabs the children he's traveling with and runs.
Because he thinks it's a monster.
He literally thinks this massive screaming iron thing is going to fall out of the sky and crush them.
It completely defies his understanding of physics.
Initially, yes. But then, almost immediately, he sees the Brooklyn Bridge. And for Nunzio, the trained engineer, this isn't a monster at all. It's a religious experience.
I love that shift in his perspective.
He looks at the suspension cables and he sees it as a cathedral of engineering.
Right. He stops being the scared, fresh-off-the-boat immigrant and instantly starts being the analyst. He's looking at the Park Row building, which I think was the tallest skyscraper in the world at the time.
It was.
And he's just fascinated by the load-bearing structures. He's doing the math in his head.
But then, of course, reality hits him hard. He's not living in the Park Row building. He's living on Elizabeth Street.
The namesake of the book.
Right. And Elizabeth Street in the early 1900s was the absolute heart of the Sicilian and Calabrian immigrant community in New York. But the living conditions?
They were brutal.
The text describes it as cave-like. You have Nunzio sleeping in a tiny windowless kitchen on a single mattress shared with 3 other grown men.
Wow.
Overcrowding is so severe that in the summer, people are just hanging halfway out of their windows all night long just to get enough oxygen to breathe.
And despite being an educated, highly intelligent engineer, Nunzio isn't out there building skyscrapers. At least not in the capacity of an engineer.
No. And this is a really crucial point about the immigrant experience that often gets overlooked in history. Credentials did not transfer.
Right.
He spoke some English, which definitely helped him, but to the American foreman running the job sites, he wasn't an engineer. He was just a quote-unquote dago.
That specific slur comes up a lot in the text.
It does, and we have to address it because it perfectly reflects the rigid hierarchy of labor at the time. You had the Irish, who had arrived a generation or 2 earlier.
Right, they just established themselves.
So they were the foremen, the police officers, the politicians, the union bosses. Then you had the newly arrived Italians at the very bottom, doing the dangerous digging and the heavy lifting. Nunzio has to fight tooth and nail just to get a job as a basic bricklayer, even though he understands the physics of the building better than the boss telling him what to do.
There's also the mention of the padrone system here, too, which I think we really need to unpack.
Yeah.
Because it's a huge part of the exploitation, and Nunzio actively tries to avoid it.
The padrone system was essentially a form of indentured servitude with extra steps. A padrono was a labor broker, usually an Italian immigrant who had just been in America longer and knew how to work the system. He would go down to the docks at Ellis Island, find the fresh-off-the-boat guys who were confused and didn't speak a word of English, and say, hey, I'm your friend, I'll get you a job, I'll get you a bed in a boarding house.
Sounds helpful on the surface.
Right, until he adds, but I take 60% of every paycheck you ever earn.
60%. That's unbelievable. So they were aggressively exploiting their own people.
Ruthlessly. It was
Yeah.
a totally predatory system. Now, Nunzio, because he speaks some English and is highly educated, he manages to bypass the Padrone system entirely and get hired directly by the companies.
Which was incredibly rare.
Very rare. And it eventually lands him a job at a major project in Brooklyn.
Right, the Brooklyn Union Gas Company.
Exactly. They were building these massive city block-sized gas tanks, these huge cylindrical iron and steel structures in Williamsburg. Nunzio actually draws a little picture of them in a letter for Giovanna and tells her they look like giant pasta pots.
Which is kind of a cute image until you realize what happens next.
Yeah.
Because this brings us to the tragic core of the story, the accident.
Yeah.
And the source material goes into very, very specific technical detail here. It's not just, oh, something fell on him. It explains exactly the physics of why it fell.
It's a fascinating and honestly horrifying look at early industrial negligence. So let's look at the actual physics here. They are building the bottom floor of this gas tank. It's a massive, solid steel disc. And it weighs about 200 tons.
200 tons? That is, I can't even picture that. That is immense.
It's a floating floor of solid, riveted steel. And they currently have it suspended in the air on these jacked and these big timber screw logs.
Suspended how high?
About 26 inches off the concrete foundation.
Wait, 26 inches? That's barely 2 feet. That's a crawl space.
Correct. It's a very tight, incredibly claustrophobic squeeze underneath this thing. Now, the engineering plan is to lower this 200-ton steel disc very, very slowly down to the floor. But on the day of the accident, the jacks are sticking. The friction is just too high.
Okay, friction. The absolute enemy of engineering.
Right. So the head engineer, not Nunzio, but the guy actually in charge, tells the site supervisor, a man named Mulligan, that the jacks need to be oiled immediately. Now, in a modern setting, you'd use hydraulics or you'd have a system to lubricate the gears remotely from a safe distance.
But this is 1902.
Exactly.
So what does Mulligan do? He decides to oil them manually.
While the disc is still suspended in the air, he orders the Italian crewmen to crawl underneath this 200-ton steel ceiling in the pitch black with only 26 inches of clearance to manually grease the cups of the jacks.
That just sounds like a death trap. You are literally crawling under a suspended massive load that is already showing mechanical failure.
It was a suicide mission, and the text strongly suggests Nunzio knew it. He questioned the order, but Mulligan was under massive pressure to get it done. Time is money. Delaying the drop costs the company.
Right.
And Nunzio is a lead man now, which means he has a small crew of his own guys to look out for. And this is really where the character of Nunzio just shines through.
He takes the dangerous spot.
Yes, the physical layout underneath the tank is critical to understand. You have the perimeter near the edges where you can scramble out quickly if something shifts. And then you have the very what they call the dead zone.
Because if you're in the center and it drops...
If something goes wrong in the center, you have absolutely nowhere to go. You can't crawl 20 feet in a split second. Nunzio sees that one of his crew members, a young guy named Mariano Idone, they called him Pretty Boy, Mariano is terrified.
The book says Mariano is visibly shaking.
He's frozen in fear. So Nunzio tells him to swap. Nunzio physically crawls to the dead center to oil the riskiest jacks himself.
And that one act of compassion, that decision, seals his fate.
September 2, 1902. It's blazing hot. It's pitch dark under there. The air under the tank is completely stagnant and suffocating. Nunzio is actually using a mental trick that Giovanna taught him back in Italy. He's imagining the cool, fresh breeze off the Strait of Scilla just to keep from panicking in the claustrophobia. And while he's greasing the cup, he realizes the pins in the jacks are loose. The whole setup is structurally unsound. It wasn't just friction, it was failing.
And then comes the snap.
He hears the timber creaking. It's that awful groan of wood taking on way too much pressure. He immediately yells Forza, which means go, to warn the other men.
And that warning saves lives.
It gives the men on the perimeter just a fraction of a split second to scramble out. It saves Mariano's life.
But Nunzio is trapped in the center.
The massive timber snaps. The primary jacks fail. The entire 200-ton steel disc lurches westward and just drops. Nunzio and 4 other men are crushed instantly.
The description of the aftermath in the text is it's grueling. It talks about the recovery effort.
It took hours and hours, and this specific detail really stays with me every time I think about it. The rescue crews had to manually cut 1,764 iron rivets to disassemble the steel plates just to retrieve the bodies.
Let's just pause on that. 1,764 rivets cut by hand.
Yep.
That's how trapped they were. They couldn't lift it. They had to take the ceiling apart piece by piece.
Exactly.
And almost immediately, the cover-up begins.
Of course it does. The Brooklyn Union Gas Company and the primary construction firm go straight into damage control. They know it was negligence. They know Mulligan screwed up by ordering men under a live load. So they start handing the survivors bonuses, which was essentially hush money, to just keep their mouths shut.
They threaten them.
They threaten deportation. They completely leverage the fact that these men are, in the eyes of the law at the time, just Italians, expendable labor.
Meanwhile, Giovanna is still back in Italy. She has no idea this has happened.
But she senses it, though.
Right, the telepathic connection.
The text depicts this literal psychic break. She wakes up shivering violently, and she just goes mute. She knows something has fundamentally broken in the universe. When the official telegram finally arrives, it really just confirms what her soul already knew.
And this tragedy leads to her finally coming to America. But obviously, it's not the joyous, triumphant reunion she had been planning for years. She arrives months later, getting off the boat, expecting to see Nunzio, and instead, her brother Lorenzo is the one who meets her at the dock.
Can you even imagine that moment? You're standing at Ellis Island, exhausted from the crossing, scanning the massive crowd for the bright red hair of the man you love, and suddenly you see your brother's grim face instead.
Giovanna's reaction is just total silence. She literally loses her voice again. She goes completely catatonic.
She just shuts down.
And soon after, she travels to the cemetery in Queens. And this scene, I have to say, it breaks my heart every single time we read it. She's walking the rows looking for his grave.
And she finds it. But there is no name. It's just a number. Number 304.
That anonymity is so violent.
It really is.
He was this vibrant, brilliant man, an engineer, a lover, a son. And the city chewed him up and reduced him to number 304 on a cheap stone in a muddy field in Queens.
It's the ultimate erasure of a human life. But Giovanna, being who she is, refuses to let him disappear like that. She performs this very specific, deeply cultural ritual right there in the dirt.
The cookies?
Yes. She brought these special rock-hard cookies from Italy called mustasol. She brought 3 of them. One is shaped like a sold fife to represent Scilla. One is shaped like a crucifix. And one is baked with their initials G and N, completely intertwined.
And she buries them at the grave.
Along with a lock of her own hair. It's a funeral rite, absolutely, but it is also a vow. She is burying her heart with him, but she is simultaneously planting a seed of vengeance. She decides right then and there that she isn't buying the company's line, that it was just an unfortunate, unavoidable accident.
And this is where the story pivots and turns into a bit of a procedural. Giovanna basically becomes a sleuth. But she has this massive glaring handicap. She is completely illiterate in English.
She doesn't speak a word of it, but she doesn't let that stop her. She physically drags her young nephew, Domenico, who has been learning English in the public schools, all the way to the Astor Library.
Which is a huge deal. You have to picture an immigrant woman in heavy mourning clothes in 1903 marching into this grand, silent marble institution. The librarians must have looked at her like she was an alien.
Oh, absolutely. But she is on a mission. She makes little Domenico help her navigate the massive archives to find the newspapers from September 1902. She wants to see the truth in black and white.
And they find it.
They do. They find the New York Times. The headline reads, 5 men killed in gas tank collapse.
And the article confirms everything she suspected.
It confirms Supervisor Mulligan was actually arrested at the scene. It confirms criminal negligence. And most importantly for her, it lists the names of the dead.
Right.
Seeing Nunzio's actual name in print in the permanent historical record, it validates her grief. It proves it wasn't just God's will, it was human error. It was, in her eyes, murder by incompetence.
So she has the paper trail. Now she knows she needs the witnesses, so she starts tracking down the survivors.
She navigates the tenements and finds a man whose nickname is No Separa, because whenever the bosses ask him a question, he just says, No speak it English.
Very smart survival tactic, honestly.
Right. He was there. And eventually she manages to track down Mariano Adone, the guy they called Pretty Boy.
And the confrontation with Mariano is incredibly intense.
It is. She corners him in a hallway,
Yeah.
and he just breaks down sobbing. He confesses to her that he was too scared to go to the center of the tank, and that Nunzio voluntarily took his place. He confesses his own cowardice to the widow of the man who saved him.
That must have been so devastating for her. To know that Nunzio died explicitly because he was saving someone else.
It's this agonizing mix of pride and rage. She is furious that Mariano gets to be alive and breathing while Nunzio is rotting in Queens. But she also gets this ultimate confirmation of Nunzio's true character.
Yeah.
He died exactly as he lived, looking out for the people around him.
And this specific revelation propels her into a massive legal battle. And this is where we meet one of the most interesting supporting characters in the entire book, Lucrezia Lamanna.
Lucrezia is fascinating. She represents the complete other side of the Italian coin in New York. She is Northern Italian. She was a fully qualified, educated doctor back in Italy.
But here in New York, she can't practice as a doctor.
Right, because she's a woman and a foreigner. The medical boards won't allow it. So she works in the slums as a midwife.
And we really need to pause on the North-South dynamic here again. Because usually, Northern and Southern Italians did not mix at all in New York.
No, they absolutely did not. There was deep systemic prejudice. Northern Italians often viewed Southerners as, well, the specific slur they used was Africans.
Wow.
They saw Southerners as dirty, uneducated peasants who were ruining the reputation of Italy and America. But Lucrezia is different. She and Giovanna bond over their shared, profound skill in healing women. Lucrezia immediately recognizes Giovanna's raw talent and treats her as an absolute equal, as a peer.
And Lucrezia is the one who explains the racial classification at Ellis Island to Giovanna, which I have to admit was genuinely shocking to me.
It is very shocking to modern ears, but it is deeply embedded in the historical record. At Ellis Island, race wasn't just a simple binary of black and white. It was a complex, hierarchical spectrum heavily influenced by eugenics.
Right.
Northern Italians, because they were generally lighter-skinned and came from industrialized cities, were often officially classified as white.
But Southern Italians weren't.
Southern Italians were sometimes officially classified as Southern Italian or even dark, which explicitly implied a non-white status on government documents.
So they were legally categorized as distinct races.
In the eyes of U.S. immigration officials and the eugenicists of the time, yes. Being Southern Italian meant you were scientifically viewed as racially inferior, more prone to criminal behavior, and less intelligent.
That is wild.
And this in-between racial status made Southern Italians incredibly vulnerable to extreme labor exploitation. Because if you aren't fully white, you simply don't get the same legal or social protections in 1902 America.
Which makes Giovanna's decision to actually file a lawsuit even more audacious.
Exactly. She is bucking the entire system. Lucrezia helps Giovanna fight. She connects her with an Italian-American lawyer, Signor DeCegli, and they sit down and decide to sue the construction firm.
Think about the optics of this. You have a poor, non-English speaking, quote-unquote, non-white immigrant widow suing a massive corporation run by the wealthiest, most powerful men in New York.
It's completely David versus Goliath, but in this case, Goliath literally owns the court system. The lawyer, DeCegli, is very honest with her. He tells her they probably won't win a dime against the Brooklyn Union Gas Company directly because the Rockefellers and Civil War generals sit on that board. But they can try to sue the specific construction firm for gross negligence.
And for Giovanna, the goal isn't really the money, is it?
No, not at all. It's about value. The company treated Nunzio like a disposable, broken tool. Break a shovel, buy a new shovel, break an Italian, hire a new Italian.
Right.
Giovanna is using the American court system to say, no, this specific life had value. You took something precious from the world. She wants the official state record to show that Nunzio mattered.
But while this whole legal battle is slowly brewing in the background, Giovanna still has to physically survive. She can't just be a grieving widow sitting in a room forever. She has to pay rent. She has to eat. And this is where her major reinvention happens. She essentially becomes the midwife of New York.
She does, and she does it by blending her traditional old world knowledge with modern medicine. Back in Scilla, she used wild herbs, poultices, honey to prevent infection.
Right.
In New York, she learns modern obstetrics from Lucrezia. She learns about bacterial sterilization, human anatomy, modern hygiene. But she also improvises constantly. There's this absolutely great anecdote in the source material about the Chinese sea urchin.
Oh, I love this part. It perfectly shows the unique geography of the Lower East Side back then. because Little Italy was right next to Chinatown.
Yes, the neighborhoods were literally bumping right up against each other. So Giovanna has a patient having a terribly difficult, agonizing birth. She needs a strong painkiller. She knows from her training that opium works best. So she just walks straight into Chinatown. Now, you have to imagine this scene. She speaks only Calabrian dialect. The older herbalist in the shop speaks only Cantonese. Neither of them speaks a single word of English.
So how on earth do they communicate complex medical needs?
Through sign language, drawing little pictures on the counter, and this deep, shared, universal understanding of plants and biology, he shows her a dried sea urchin preparation and some specific roots. They nod at each other. They instantly understand each other as fellow healers.
That's amazing.
She takes the preparation, which contains very trace amounts of opium and glycerin, and she runs back and uses it to save the mother who was in blinding pain.
It's just such a beautiful moment of cross-cultural connection. It really shows how incredibly cosmopolitan the immigrant experience actually was.
Yeah.
You weren't just in a bubble. You're rubbing shoulders with the entire world in those tenements.
Exactly. And because of moments like that, Giovanna becomes an absolute legend in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
She's delivering babies, saving mothers from bleeding out, navigating the dark tenement hallways at all hours of the night. She builds authority. She has a real career.
But she's still incredibly lonely, or at least her family thinks she needs to be settled down.
Enter Rocco Siena.
Rocco. I don't even know where to begin with Rocco.
Rocco is the absolute anti-Nunzio. If Nunzio was soaring poetry, Rocco is blunt prose.
Yeah.
Nunzio was tall, red-headed, highly educated, romantic. Rocco's short, very stocky, completely illiterate, and very rough around the edges. He works with his hands. And he's a widower who has 3 young children.
And the family, specifically her brother Lorenzo and his wife Teresa, they basically set this whole thing up, right?
It's a completely pragmatic, old-world arrangement. Teresa desperately wants Giovanna out of her apartment.
Because Giovanna is too much.
Giovanna is too imposing, she's too competent, she makes more money, and it makes Teresa feel wildly insecure in her own home. Meanwhile, Rocco desperately needs a mother for his 3 kids. He's drowning in responsibilities.
And the proposal scene, I mean, calling it a proposal is almost a stretch. It is so incredibly unromantic, it's almost painful to read.
It really is. It happens on a wooden bench overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge. Giovanna goes there often just to be close to Nunzio's memory because of how much he loved the bridge. Rocco meets her there, and he doesn't profess his undying love. He doesn't get down on one knee.
What does he say?
He basically looks at her and says, I don't ask you for love. I ask for a partner. I need a mother for my children. I am a hard worker. I don't drink my paycheck. And I will bring you your coffee in bed every morning.
It's a literal business proposition.
It is a survival contract between 2 battered adults, and Giovanna accepts it.
But why? She clearly does not love him.
Because she desperately wants children. She and Nunzio had tried back in Italy, but it never happened for them. And she's 31 years old now, which in 1904 immigrant terms was considered very old to be starting a family.
Right.
She realizes a hard truth. She will never, ever love anyone the way she loved Nunzio. That part of her heart is permanently buried in that numbered grave in Queens. But she can still have a family. She can still be a mother.
There's a condition, though, a very specific, intense stipulation she makes before she agrees to marry him.
Yes. They agree to name their firstborn children together after their deceased spouses.
Wow.
If they have a girl, she will be named Angelina after Rocco's late wife. If they have a boy, his name will be Nunzio.
That is just such a heavy, heavy legacy to put on a newborn child. Imagine growing up knowing, hello, you are named directly after the great defining tragedy of my entire life.
It is heavy. But for them, in that culture, it was the only way of honoring the past. It's how they reconcile living with ghosts. They aren't trying to erase their past loves. They are literally building their new family on top of them.
And they get married at City Hall.
Right.
Not a church.
A brief civil ceremony. Giovanna insists on this to explicitly distinguish it from her real, spiritual, eternal marriage to Nunzio before God. And she finally wears colors. She takes off the heavy widow's black she's been wearing for years.
So she completely transitions from the grieving, paralyzed widow to the powerful matriarch of a new family. She essentially defeats the new Scilla not by fighting it head-on, but by adapting to it and outliving it.
Precisely. She survives. She endures. And this perfectly brings us to the frame narrative of the book itself, because the story is told, in part, through the modern memories of the author Laurie Fabiano, remembering her grandmother and her great-grandmother.
The green fence garden.
Yes. So we flash forward to the 1960s. The family has successfully moved out of the Lower East Side tenements. They're in New Jersey now, suburbia. The American dream realized. But they bring the old country with them. The grandfather, Nunno, who is Rocco's son-in-law, he builds this massive, sprawling Italian garden behind a big green fence.
He's growing fig trees and basil in the middle of New Jersey.
Which is not biologically easy. You have to physically bend the fig trees over, wrap them in heavy burlap, and literally bury them in trenches just so they survive the freezing Northeast winters. But he does it every single year. And there's this incredibly vivid image of him standing out there watering his plants and singing "God Bless America" at the top of his lungs to his Italian fig tree.
That image is just so perfect. Singing a patriotic American anthem to a Mediterranean tree wrapped in burlap to survive the cold.
It perfectly encapsulates the entire multi-generational journey. They adapted to the brutal climate. They survived the friction. They didn't get devoured by the Scilla. They planted deep roots.
And we find out right at the end that Giovanna, they called her the Big Nanny. She lived all the way until 1963. The text notes she died on the exact same day JFK was shot.
Which is a wildly symbolic ending of an era in itself. The source material specifically mentions the little printed prayer card from her funeral. It reads, Giovanna Costa, 1873 to 1963.
80 years.
Think about that span of time. She spanned the entire transformation of human history, from living in a feudal cliffside fishing village without electricity, all the way to seeing the atomic age and the space race on television.
So, bringing it all back to the very beginning, the book is called Elizabeth Street.
Elizabeth Street is the crucible of the whole story. It's where the worst suffering happened, the claustrophobia, the poverty, the horrific loss of Nunzio. But it's also the forge. It's where Giovanna was forcefully hammered into a completely new shape.
Yeah.
She stopped being just a passive victim of the massive industrial machine, and she became an active, fierce participant in her own survival.
It really makes you wonder, though, if the accident hadn't happened.
That is the most haunting question of the whole book. If Mulligan hadn't ordered those men under the pank, if Nunzio had lived.
Giovanna would have come over as a doctor's wife eventually.
Maybe she would have gone to medical school like they planned. But she likely would have been much more sheltered. The tragedy forced her out into the world. It forced her to investigate a corporation, to sue powerful men, to work the bloody tenement streets as a midwife, to marry a complete stranger just to build a family. Her voice, which she literally lost to trauma and found again at Ellis Island, was entirely forged by that pain.
And it leaves you with this lingering thought. How many other incredible, tragic stories are just permanently buried under those numbered stones in Queens?
Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Every single skyscraper in New York, every subway tunnel you ride through, every suspension bridge you drive over has a Nunzio somewhere in its foundation history. We just usually don't have a Giovanna left behind to tell us the story.
So next time you're walking in this city, look up at the steel rivets. Think about the 1,764 rivets that had to be cut by hand in the dark.
And think about the woman who made sure every single one of them was counted.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive into Elizabeth Street. We'll catch you on the next one.
Arrivederci.